Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Yoga Healer podcast. I'm super thrilled to have Durga Leela here with me today to talk about her journey with recovery and her training program, Yoga of Recovery, which has helped so many people. Durga's background is also in Ayurveda and yoga. And you can find her book, Yoga of Recovery, and her work, Yoga of Recovery, at yogaofrecovery.com. I love iteration for remembering things. Awesome. So Durga, I'd love for you to start with your story and really your life path with addiction and recovery. I read through your notes, and I'll just quickly sort of sum up and then have you dive in like wherever seems like a good point. So you're a child of an alcoholic. You became an alcoholic in your teens. You found yoga in your 20s. You attempted suicide a few times. You lost your mother to alcoholism at 32. And then shortly after that, you lost a critical job and moved and had a bit of a wake-up call and went to AA. And 18 months later, your doc prescribed antidepressants for clinical depression, and you went more on a healing journey into Ayurveda, is what it sounded like. That seems like a really tough start to life.
Yeah, that's part of my story. And again, it's part of it because there's a timeline to a story. And even in the living of tough situations, there's a lot events happening that are teaching you things that are actually specific to your life. And so, yeah, I did the Big Geographic. That's what it's generally called in recovery, when you seek a change in yourself, but you change the external circumstances of your life. And so I really got to America and I moved to Lake Tahoe, which is a really beautiful place. I'm still stunned by it. I don't live there anymore. But wherever you go there, you are. So this like conditioning, this personality arrived with me. I kind of write about my life was a shambles, and yet I had this idea of what it could be. And so what actually helped it manifest towards something that I was more comfortable with, that was something that was like more of actually who I was the moving into sobriety. And that was deeply necessary for me. And sobriety for me described as total abstinence from alcohol, then drugs. And then eventually upon the forming of Yoga Recovery, it was about the cigarettes. So, and this is where I bring in this just true blessing of being introduced to Ayurveda. So I was always a yoga practitioner, which I kind of find that funny because this was, several years ago. Maybe I started yoga about 25, 30 years ago. And not many other people did it, but it's the only thing I did. Other people were doing the gym and maybe aerobics, and that was not something that I was interested in. But I did go to yoga and it worked for me. I couldn't tell you what it did. It didn't resolve my alcoholism. And my alcoholism definitely caused my suicide attempts. I tended not to get that extreme without the influence of alcohol in my system, whether actively drunk or the depressant effects on my system the morning after, which probably was the most dangerous point for me. Because at least drunk, I got something of a high, but the effects of the alcohol in my system the day after, and that sickness and darkness was, that was probably the worst I've ever experienced. So those people who wonder, like, is this an addiction, or, am I just using this too much? That whole questioning that goes on. Like, firstly, I have this thing that I heard once, and I was like, well, that's interesting, where someone said, a normal drinker never actually wonders if they're an alcoholic. And I thought, I wonder, is that true? I wonder. But I never really wondered if I was an alcoholic. I absolutely knew I was. And my whole energy was to not let anybody else know that. Although to a lot of people it would have been really apparent. But what's interesting is because of comparing, and I come from a family that's been afflicted with lots of mental health and addiction issues. So really I looked like maybe the more successful, healthy one.
Mhm.
But that's a kind of building a facade. And the facade I built was the one that I needed to get me out from where I was, which was my family and country of origin. Because I had ambition. I was going to go and get away from this problem, and I was going to recreate my own life. So it is depressing when you're unable to do that. But the only reason I was unable to do it really was because my coping mechanism for all the unresolved emotions and feelings that I had was alcohol and sometimes drugs. I wasn't as addicted to drugs as I was to alcohol. I really had that, phenomenon of craving as soon as I introduced it to my system. So therefore, every time I drank, I was like a woman on a mission, and I really never knew where I was going to end up. So when it came to being in sobriety, and then not, like I would say, my therapist didn't think that I was launching into this, successful reclaiming my life. But there was a part of me that was defiant against what people thought I should be wanting for my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say this thing, which I often say, I had done the going to school and getting a job and being a professional. And I did it because it's like what was outlined, that it would be good for me to do that. It was kind of easy for me to do academic things and pass exams. So as a child of an alcoholic, what I really had in my mind was, when I do this, she'll get better. So like that wishful thinking, and that didn't quite work. So therefore, in sobriety, when people were asking me to get back to my corporate career, that was just dead inside me, because she was dead, like my mother is the she. So given that all that effort hadn't saved her, why would I go back to it? So that is a really interesting perspective for me to think about. And within that Western medical model, and a therapist who I really loved, but I was cleaning houses and bussing tables to, pay the rent. And then I was just finding time to live my life and find out who I was.
Well, and let's just pause, because like that's kind of normal in ski. I've lived in a ski town, and there's like that's kind of normal behavior at like a lot of different ages in a ski town. So I would imagine that it felt supported by community in a way, and maybe not by someone else's, more corporate hierarchy perspective of your life.
Yeah, there you go, Kate. I mean, I moved from London, which is, the corporate capital of the world. And I used to work right beside the stock exchange and stuff. And then I was in the wake and bake town of Lake Tahoe, and, Tahoe time and later, dude. And so it was poles apart, and I was living with artists and architects and things. So they were coming from a very different space. Californians in general are a little different from Scottish people, and I'm from Scotland, and I'm from Glasgow, which is definitely, it's a city with a lot of edge to it, we could call it, and back in that city, even as I studied, I managed bands and I ran a nightclub. My nightclub was called Club Malaria, funnily enough, given that I now live partly in India. So, it's all kind of weird. But anyway, that's where I had taken myself in the geographic. That was the two worlds kind of pushing and pressing against each other. So all I did was keep meditating and praying for dharma. This word really fascinated me, dharma, that there was use and purpose to my life. And if I could tap into that, that's what I would do. And I am a person of action. And so I needed something to really focus my efforts into. And I went to an ashram for the first time as a smoking rehab, because I was seriously insane trying to give up cigarettes. And that was my own challenge to myself, that I should give up cigarettes before I resorted to the pharmaceuticals, the antidepressants, because smoking, and I know you cover a lot about allergies and asthma. Well, I was an asthmatic that smoked. So I had my Ventolin inhaler, and I'd often take a puff on that and then light up a cigarette. As I say, that's depressing. like to have that part of your rational mind watch yourself do that, especially then whilst I was in recovery. And then the thing that really it just baffles me is that seemed to be okay. In this realm of what is addiction and how it's treated, cigarettes get a free pass. It's just so interesting. The number one killer, the highest incidence of addiction from first time use is nicotine, cigarettes, and yet freely available. You can walk into, what I always found amazing was what we would call the chemist, the place that you got your prescriptions. In America, sold cigarettes and booze. So that was like, how can this be? So like there was a bit of a culture shock, and there was this inner awakening that was like in a push-pull. What should I do? Should I follow the money, do what I've been trained to do? Or do I have the courage and kind of faith and trust to show up for a life that hasn't been mapped out for me on the externals, but inwardly? There was this, I think there was just this need for something authentic, and actually a capacity to go with it and trust it, which in some sense I find amazing, because my whole career was based on the hope that it would cure my mother and my own security, because I didn't like dependence. I didn't like being dependent on people that I found volatile and untrustworthy. So, whether I was going to be with friends, a romantic partner, I always had to establish my independence. So I needed to be a free agent and be able to take care of myself. That was like my primary driving message. So there we are. I started Yoga Recovery, which is integrating Ayurveda into recovery pathways, but primarily 12 steps. So this is part of my joke, that it was a healing system that so many people had not heard of. And I was trying to bring it to an anonymous group of people with no marketing budget. So the fact that we're still here is pretty much probably a story of dharma, in truth,
Yeah. Yeah. So when did you first have meaning or dharma as a concept introduced? Was that in your 20s with yoga, or was it at another time?
I don't actually remember the first idea of it, to be honest. And it's a good question, because even I think, why was I so interested in dharma? I think I must have read something. I do remember being in London, and I lived with my partner, he was a geophysicist, so very kind of scientific, and I was suffering, and I decided to go to a little Buddhist meeting, and they were doing breathing techniques, and I came back and I was just so excited about that. And he just thought it was ludicrous that I would sit in a room with other people inhaling and exhaling and counting the breath. And I was just like stunned by his reception of that. So I guess there was always this draw towards something of dharma. I did yoga with the Shivananda Yoga London Centre, because when I found a place that was it. It was quite near where I lived in London, and I don't know that there was many other London centres. So they might have introduced it to me, or the Buddhists might have introduced it to me. I can't remember, but when a seed lands and it sprouts. Yeah. So I don't know how many seeds have been thrown my way, thousands, but not everything takes. And I always have this as an idea, like sometimes like there's so much coming at us, there's lots of information, there's lots of choices, but something like uplifts in me when I hear something, and I really recognize that. It's like I sit up and move forward, like, oh, what's that? And so I think I follow those pathways.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, it's a question that I'm super curious about. So those who aren't familiar with dharma, the sense of to uphold, or duty, or calling, or life of purpose, orienting towards meaning, in defining the self, like defining the life's work, rather than kind of just it's not that there's not allowing life to happen to you, but there's much more of some sort of compulsion that I think that's something that we share, Durga, is that like just, and I had it early in my 20s too, when the path laid out for me by culture was clearly not my path. And it brought me to, you know, the people that knew me were raising eyebrows, you know, like, what are you doing? What are you, what, you know, and, but you've been trained to be want to go to law school or something, you know, or that sort of thing. And there is so much energy. I think when some people who might be feeling this, like with purpose or dharma, you're accessing universal energy. So there's just this cosmos or world of energy that becomes available when you step into alignment on the path of dharma. And it leads you to people and places and ideas, and to create organizations often, or to create, to generate, to step into you as creator. So let's talk a little bit about addiction and allopathic care, or like the Western, like what's actually available to people, whether they're in a public healthcare system like in Europe or Canada, or a private healthcare system, or don't have access to a healthcare system, but how the cultural paradigm for addiction around allopathic is more pharmaceutical and drug oriented, cure oriented, rather than care oriented. And how in Ayurveda you found that Ayurveda was, you know, and I have too, is this, I love how you worded it, a foundational behavioral healthcare system that is working at the foundations of your behavior. And it's self-care to me. It's like a self-care system that does work for anyone. Like it's universal in that sense. So I'd love to hear, in terms of your work with addiction, and why this self-care, behavioral self-care model is essential to being whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So very nicely put. You've covered a lot of the points there, and I'll pick up on just the idea of the Western model has a disease, a diagnosis, and a cure. And it centers largely and increasingly around a pharmaceutical cure, or a surgical cure, or those two things combined. It excels at acute care. And I think we can all say we're really grateful for that. You know, with my asthmatic problem, it saved my life before. You know, where the system goes into that distress level, disease level, that really needs that immediate intervention that provides that immediate alleviation of symptoms. But if the symptoms are being caused by the lifestyle choices, then that model hasn't yet made itself available to the more chronic care issues. It doesn't deliver quite as much as of the returns on investment that model is particularly interested in. And we're seeing that with chronic diseases. I remember sitting in my Ayurveda school, and we had a pharmaceutical drug company rep with us, and this was back in 2001, and he said, you know, if you have any money, invest it in dialysis care, the dialysis companies, because the way they're treating diabetes means more and more people are going to end up in dialysis, and therefore you'll make a fortune on those stocks. Yeah. And my father had died at 44 of diabetes, and I was kind of shocked by that idea that you can, and this is like a philosophical life question, can you really make a profit on the back of other people's suffering? Yeah. Like, what will you do with that profit? Where will that profit actually take you? And this is something that it actually comes into the recovery industry, because you know, some people have set up like high-end rehabs, and that's great. If you've got money, it's good. If you want to go and spend 50,000 for a month in a rehab and you have those funds, good, go ahead, it's your money, do as you like with it. But there isn't, it's funny because the level of treatment, I would say, is these high range, like 5-star rehabs for the elite.
Yeah.
And then you get a little bit of treatment for the people that are in the criminal justice system. So the other end of the spectrum, usually generated through adverse community experiences, adverse childhood experiences, poverty, systemic racism, all the rest of it. And you get a very brutal level of care down here and a very luxurious level of care up here, but all the middle people get very little at all, you know. And so you say Ayurveda is like self-care, and yes, it is primarily, but also for my life, I also need to go and receive care. And so like I do run by invitation only because it's a big trip and we need to know that you're suitable for it. But each year we go over to India and into Vijayagram at Ayurveda Sustainable Healing Village Clinic, and we take treatment. Because when did we understand that we could live our life unaided? I mean, like when I go to India or I go to Thailand or something, I notice they're much more caring for each other, even on a physical level. Here in this country, we've kind of stopped that idea of being able to care for each other outside of the licensed clinical professionals.
Well, it's part of the, I mean, the rugged individualism, right? And it's like, there's just a huge cost.
Yeah. And it is a huge cost. I mean, I am not part of like I arrived into America from Britain, which is a socialized healthcare model. And I arrive here and it's this pay per service model, and you need to have this health insurance, but it's very limited in what you can get. And I never went to a rehab, Kate, but I do know people who do go to rehabs, and I know people who are trying to find rehabs for people that are like in immediate need. You know, there's life danger involved, and that's almost a full-time job. So we do have interventionists that will help people locate the right facility for their person. Like, do you have a 22-year-old female? Do you have a 50-year-old? Do you have like a 75-year-old that might have some memory loss and is starting to use pharmaceuticals as well as alcohol and be a danger to themselves? This problem is huge. So I think, you know, when I was over in India with Dr. Ramkumar, he mentioned this book, Medical Nemesis by Ivan Illich. And he talks about the over professionalization of healthcare. And that's something that I agree with. We've lost the circle in the community. We've lost that, you know, community care, just being able to show up as intelligent people living on the planet and be able to provide care at that level. So we all have the idea that the experts know best and they're going to come in and cure us of this. So I start teaching Ayurveda, and the three words that I hear from people just spontaneous is "this makes sense," which I think is so funny because we teach from the senses, that this sense-based embodied self. And so like, what's the pitfalls of that? Because behind that are these like turbulent emotions and feelings and, you know, self-restrictions. Well, I shouldn't say that, and I shouldn't do this because there's so many like rules holding us back from authentically being ourselves. So it's a very complex, multi-layered subject. And it's the people themselves are calling for a conversation about it that is a little bit less restricting than the radical monopoly medical model allows it to be. You know, so you have health insurance and you think you're going to be covered, and like not just addiction, but all diseases. When it actually comes to it, that's a real challenge to find what you're going to be covered for, what the treatments are. So
I mean, there's one, if chronic disease can't really be treated by allopathic medicine at this point, all chronic disease. I mean, if it's chronic inflammation driven, it's a care model, like you're saying. It's not a cure model, and it's behavioral, it's lifestyle driven. It's lifestyle, it's diet, it's all the things we're in control of each day. So emotional inflammation, if I look at it this way, addiction is emotional inflammation. The emotional inflammation, my guess for most people, starts either in utero or immediately postpartum, where they aren't getting attachment. They're not getting the kind of care, of infant care or in utero care, in order to stabilize their psyche, right? And so then what does the recovery do? It's like it goes back and helps the individual reparent themselves,
Yeah.
attach to themselves, so that they don't violate themselves, they don't toxify themselves, they don't. I mean, the level of emotional instability that leads to addiction, right? It's like when we look at like where does it start? And if Ayurveda is really looking at like how do we get to the root of the problem, we have to go back to the start, right? At some point. If your parents can't take care of you the way that your needs need to be met as a human being, then you've got to go back. We've all got to go back and reconnect the care we should have had on the physical level, on the emotional level, on the spiritual or dharmic, or even beyond that level into just the beingness, right? The ability just to be in bliss, the birthright, of a well cared for baby.
Yeah, so we should definitely look after mothers. We don't do a very good job of that. I cover this in the book, and all I do for that is bring in our friend Claudia, because she wrote that article about the macrocosm and the microcosm, and like laying your whole lifeline against the daytime, and pointing out then that how do you work with and care for these like issues that you can't change the past. And there's a recovery saying that when you're in your recovery, when you stop wishing for a better past. And so like to empower yourself in that is to get up early in the morning and do these daily routines. And even as I say that, sometimes it's like, really, does that really do it? But I've been doing it for 20 years, and I definitely do believe, yes, it does. It does it. It changes your relationship to self. So you are bringing up an idea in addiction right now, which is the attachment disorder. So, they talk about the addicted attachment, the avoided attachment, and the ambivalent attachment. And definitely in yoga recovery, we talk about the relational aspect of our addictiveness. So we say, in relationship to ourselves. So to me, there has been nothing more helpful than the Constitution for me to understand who I actually am in relation to other people. And I say this as resolving the shoulds. Like, I should be nicer, more friendly, more compassionate. They should be more focused, more quiet, less fidgety. So the shoulds type of thing. And then once I understood that divine energy actually manifests through 5 elements, and people bring that forth, and it often looks like personality, and there's a recovery saying principles before personalities. I now understand that saying from the principles of active elemental energies within me, within you, and I get to enjoy it more now, like watching someone's airiness or heated fire approach, and I don't need to take it so personally. I don't need to become that, and I don't need to make them something different from what they are, but to honor what they're manifesting at whatever level of consciousness they're at. And I think all the yoga pathways show us a way to manifest that more consciously. So our whole healing system does look into who we are as a person. So when I dealt with it in the book, I asked Claudia, can I just put the whole article in that book, because it is so powerful, that we can change the past, which is really the body, the embodied self, the way like Nikki Meyer says the issues are in the tissues. So we can do that on a daily basis. And, to say for the medical model, we still need the acute care. I've been running yoga recovery retreats for years. But my requirement when we're in person was 90 days continuous abstinence from your chemical of choice, you know, or behavioral addictions, you need to be stable enough to show up and self-initiate a disciplined daily practice whilst you're here, because we're not going to come to your room and police you and drug test you and, you know, search you out. That's that kind of nudge from the judge rehab care level. And detox, you know, whatever all that looks like. Maybe some people can get into that from the holistic Ayurveda care level, but in my mind, we need a little bit of that fog cleared up. And so the acute care model needs to hand on to a continuum of care model. And I heard this phrase recently from the county healers, a cascade of care, rather than this scarcity of care that seems to be part of our picture. Like, how is it you can get to the most developed country in the world in the 21st century and there's a scarcity of care? That's kind of ludicrous.
Pathological.
And then when we mention the care that we wish to bring to the table, then they start banging on about evidence-based medicine and evidence-based techniques. And it's like, well, thousands of years, isn't that evidence? And so
there's evidence. I just did a year of research. There's evidence of chronic inflammation and all the dinacharya. There's science-based, you know, there's double-blind studies, there's all that now. So it is there. And I want to talk about this, that, you know, one of your definitions of addiction is bio, psycho, social, emotional, cultural, economic, political issue. And I want to focus on the biology and the daily rhythms, like what you're doing in the yoga recovery and getting people synchronized to circadian rhythm enables their pineal gland to start to generate serotonin, and their cerebrospinal fluid to start to generate serotonin again. And if we look at nourishment and nutrition as part of this, right? Like, part of the problem with addiction is that there's malnutrition, and that's due to the chemical nature of overusing any substance in the body that's highly toxic, right? Is you're going to have massive depletion. And so when I hear your story about how you were in your 20s and would drink a lot, and then the next day would just be at the low of the low, it's like there's a level of biochemistry that can't support a positive mood. I was really intrigued in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial when he talked about cutting himself, and he's like, well, you know, he's had so many addiction issues over so long, his like body's not able to generate serotonin. And, you know, it's like there's a biological reality to addiction that I think a lot of us who aren't addicted don't realize, and people who are addicted don't understand the importance of digestion, of diet, of nourishment, and of nourishment directly from circadian rhythm. Now, like, when those two are paired up, you actually have a shot of generating the biochemistry to have positive emotion. And when you have positive emotion, you're able to take on positive stressors. When you have negative emotion, you have negative bias, which means you make a mountain out of a molehill. When you have positive bias, you make a mountain you make a molehill into a mountain. With negative, and with positive, you take the mountain and you make it into a molehill. You downsize it because you have adversity habits. You have the adversity habits that are lock, stock, and barrel, proven by evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to have developed the human being. And without these adversity habits, which the yogis and the Vaidya's call dinacharya, right? The daily rhythm that you're teaching in all your programs, that I teach in all my programs, that Claudia teaches in all her programs. And we're talking about Claudia Welch, by the way. That this is so foundational and so lost. And it used to be understood 100 years ago. It's like everyone knew it. It makes sense, right? Because everyone was doing it, because we had to, because before electricity, you were going to bed earlier and you're waking up early and you were eating in daylight. And that solves for most of it. Your pineal gland, your eyes are now feeding messages into your pineal gland at dusk that it's time to, you know, turn on the chemicals that help you wind down, and before dawn, turning on the chemicals that help you wake up. And that just doesn't happen when there's this level of depletion.
Yeah. I think it's the whole pace of our actual nervous system against the pace of the world that we're living in. There's a discord there. So you make so many good points. And like I often say in recovery in general, but I think just in this world in general, if there's 5 senses, if there is a 6th sense, it has to be a sense of humor.
Yeah,
And
I love it.
I heard this joke once of, you know, let me say it, that who does an alcoholic call when their car breaks down? The suicide hotline.
Ah!
Because that's what you were just talking about, that this kind of built-in negative feedback to adversity. It's like this amplified reactions, but that is being mirrored to us by our culture. You know, it really has become a cultural thing. Especially if you watch the media, like if you watch the news, everything's amplified.
Yes.
David Frawley puts this beautifully when he says that the sugar and salt in our nutrition is the boosting to the addictiveness of food. Yes. You know, yes. Like wholesome, natural food, we would eat it and we would get our satiation point. But when you add more sugar and salt, it's like you're engineering addiction into the processed food chain. Yeah, and then absolutely. When it comes to the feeding of impressions, and you're talking about this emotional inflammation, then you're getting that from the idea of sex and violence in the media's input to what we're seeing. So we're kind of hyped up and swinging from extremes. And, you know, and then we wonder, like, especially in the addiction field, when we remove the drug of choice, and I often say that's an old-fashioned term too, it's the distraction of choice. Yeah. When you remove that, then you find all these like little whack-a-mole problems coming up underneath, because then you're going to get down to the root of the issues. So like there's this thing about, you know, recovery is a lifetime process, sorry. So that's all true because we are invited into this deep healing system. So I often say, you know, I just mentioned my father, I think I don't know much about him because he was dead by the time I was 5, but he died at 44 from type 1 diabetes, kidney failure. And his 2 brothers had died before him, and his mother had died when he was 14. So there's a lot of early death in his family. And of course, with my family, we didn't know the other brother because there had been a falling out. So I knew nothing of his side apart from this type 1 diabetes. And then on my mother's side, there's heart issues and, you know, alcoholism issues. So therefore, I come from this line of alcoholics with heart disease and diabetes. So like when I came off of alcohol, my first love showed up again, which was sugar. Yeah.
Well, that's the first addiction, right? If you look back, right? Even if you look at like before you were an alcoholic as a teenager, wasn't there sugar?
Yeah.
Because I mean, sugar it's what, 200 times stronger than cocaine in terms of the psychotropic addiction tendency.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a commodity. And I just want to clarify this, like for those who study Ayurveda, like sugar is not a taste, it's a commodity. Sweetness is a taste. So refined sugar it's not a food.
That's so well put. It's a drug.
It's a drug. And it's a distraction.
Well, yeah. I mean, emotion. It's how we show love too, and so it's a tough one to overcome. I'm 22 years in recovery, and I have still not managed complete abstinence from sugar. I do it every now and then. Caffeine, I do every now and then. But those are the 2 that I'm playing out with. But those are just the actual material substances where I get to distract myself from the emotional turmoil that I live in. Yeah. And, you know, to be in this life, to be in this world, there's going to be emotional turmoil. So that's one of the things. From a biological level, we do have panchakarma, we do have this dinacharya, we do have living a day well, one day at a time, which I think that's brilliance from the recovery model, living one day at a time. It's also brilliance from the Ayurveda model to have a nutrition system based in taste. Because at that turning point when I was praying for dharma, I knew it had something to do with food, especially as I stood in front of the fridge every time I had something that I couldn't cope with and I couldn't have a cigarette anymore. And you know, it's like you open the fridge and the light comes on. It's like, yeah, this isn't really the enlightenment that I'm looking for. And I'm standing here knowing that I'm not hungry, hating myself because I easily gain weight.
Yeah.
And you know, I've got the whole culture body dysmorphia thing going on. And yet I want that ice cream, you know. So like I very quickly was at that thing. And so I thought, oh, I need to become a nutritionist. And so I picked up books that looked like the phone book on nutrition. And I was just like, oh my God, like
this
how
isn't
would I
it.
ever learn this? And so then when I heard that Ayurveda had its nutrition policy based in 6 tastes, I always say this, I almost fell off my chair. I was like, that is pure genius. Because how can it be that we as people living on this planet for this long need that much intellectual information about food? Like food is a communion from the Divine Mother. Food is an offering. Food is something that we are participating in constantly. Like, you know, I've got 4 wee vegetable boxes in my garden. And just we're out there every night, like coaxing on our little corns. Like we've never done this before, so we don't really know much about it. But it's really having us join in like what it is to actually receive food. And I think it's the biggest ingratitude that we have. But again, to look at what people have been trying to resolve, like world hunger, things like that's an honorable task. But I think it's like we whiz past the actual, the wisdom of nature in our egotistical savior mode.
I mean, I think
does that quite often.
I mean, it's like we're mammals, and watch how other mammals figure out what they're eating in their ecosystem, right? And as we taste things, and that's what you do, because with taste you can spit or swallow, right? It's like this, right? It's just, it goes so, and I eat a lot of wild foods. I taste a lot of plants. I'm very adventuresome. And I know a lot of plant medicine, and I know quite a bit about my local ecosystem, but not everything, because there's in any thriving ecosystem, there's hundreds of plants. And it's like you take a nibble of something and you can tell the energetics on your body instantly. Like there's right now the aspen leaves are coming in, and the young aspen leaves are, according to the Native Americans, they're medicinal. They're not really edible. They're medicinal, which means they have a very strong action. So if you want to clear phlegm out of your system, it's like you put a few aspen leaves in your mouth. You probably won't want to swallow them. You're going to release a lot of their biochemistry. It'll mix with yours, and it'll cause you to, huck loogies and clear your nostrils and clear your bodhaka kapha in Ayurveda. Like it'll cleanse your bodhaka kapha. It'll replenish your oralome, or the microbiome in your mouth. Like all of these things will happen. And we used to know, and now I'm calling them primal habits, because to me they're habits that they're adversity habits, and they're prime. They're just prime to the human species. Like they're irreducible. You can't reduce them further. Whereas those modern nutrition books are like, they're overly analytical and complex and playing into, like you were saying in the beginning, the expert knows everything. The user experience is nothing. And it's like, no, flip that on its head. The user experience is everything.
Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure
that's the life. Michael Pollan says, I can't remember the words, but on that book, he writes, here's the words that my book is about. And then I have to write 200 pages to like verify it and confirm it. And I wish I knew what the words were, but eat less, or eat more plants, exercise more or something.
Totally. So I want to talk about addiction as a spiritual malady before we jet. And that you found this both in Ayurveda and in 12 steps. In Ayurveda, we have this idea of forgetting our true nature as a spirit in matter. We have also the concept of svastha, or being deeply seated in the self, which is on all planes. It's not just at the level of physiology, it's also at the level of psychology, it's also at the level of community and the level of communion. And so when we have that wholeness, we don't desire, and I keep finding this so much as my community at Yoga Healer has really embraced urine therapy. People who are very expert in yoga and Ayurveda are really the first ones that took to it most, is they just find that there's this level, and it's so freaking bizarre. Like the whole experience of urine therapy, especially as people get very advanced in it, you have a feeling of being self-supported at all times because you always have your medicine with you, you have your nourishment with you, and you have your hydration with you. And that psychologically reprograms our experience of needing something else to be whole, or that the universe leaves us unsupported. And it's so deep. It's so physiologically deep, and it's so psychologically deep. And then there's this level of like the communion of like, I'm already whole. Like, and that's the thing that I keep hearing, just like you keep hearing it makes sense. We keep hearing this like, oh, I'm whole unto myself, or some variation of that. So I'd love for you to talk about in your work with people around spiritual awakening and recovery, what are some of the common trends that you see with your members?
Mm-hmm. It's a big topic. I think what I would say, this is what's coming to me recently when I was speaking to people, that you have a biochemical allopathic model that has now put the diagnosis description as a chronic relapse in brain disease. And so the brain is an organ in the body, and that's definitely working at the chemical level. So therefore, the proposal is a chemical solution, and the drug companies are coming in more and more to provide. And listen to this timeline. It was medicated assisted detox, medicated assisted treatment, medicated assisted recovery. So that timeline went from a couple of weeks to stabilize a person. And believe me, don't discount how important that is, because I watched my mother with DTs. You can't really have someone just come off of some of these heavy substances, especially with the opiates that have been handed out like candy to people that are maybe too young or just given too many. So, but see the timeline: detox to treatment to recovery. So then therefore we have this kind of like, we're treating this as a chronic disease, and it's a chronic relapse in disease, and so therefore these pharmaceuticals will support you for life. And the issue is that when you've had somebody that has been so desperately ill and close to death, your loved ones don't ever want you to come off those pills, because what they witness is you were so ill and now you're well, and it's because of these pills. So is that really the truth? Well, there is the biochemical level. And so I love how David Frawley talks about this. That's for us the 5 elements, and we talk about the 3 doshas. But then in a holistic model, there's this next level of our being, which is the subtle body. So here we're talking about the mind and the emotions, the energy system, the prana, the chi, according to Chinese medicine. Now that is influencing the chemical level. So that's more powerful. And he says that works on an electrical level. And so the electrical level really, it centers into the heart. So you see work like this in heart math, that they're beginning to see that the heart signals are actually stronger than the brain signals. And in our system, we have that connection to the brain heart at the subdosha level. We do understand that. We do understand it in the level of the subtle doshas, prana, tejas, and ojas. And then come up to the next level, the causal level, what we would call, if it's body, mind, spirit. So the causal level is this idea of the blueprint, the thing that we come in here for, like what is life about? So as a suicidal alcoholic, I had this kind of ongoing existential crisis. I'm being loaded with religion and academics. I'm living with people that I love and I'm attached to, but I'm watching them like destroy themselves and self-destructive habits, whilst telling me to do the opposite of what they're doing. And, just all these rules and regulations that are being foisted on me, and I can't make sense of it. I am desperate for the truth. And so it's one of the things that I often say, for me at the spiritual level, the resolution was Jnana Yoga, Vedanta. So I feel as if I had thirsted my whole life. And when I heard that, which is close to the Buddhism philosophical aspect or presentation of what life is about, then it felt like the drink that I had thirsted for all my life, and that switched me. But again, when Frawley describes this, he says that level is magnetic. And so we will attract to ourselves the people, circumstances, and events that give us opportunities to work through some of the life lessons that we're here for in this life university. And I often wonder, like, why was I born into this family? Why have I gone through these things? Like, why are you rich and you're diseased and you're, you know, talented? Like, what is all that about? How can there be equity in a life like this? So that magnetic, that causal, that spiritual level is what it's about. So I think a holistic system gives us more of a expanded window to look at, to see who we are. And, you know, I often start, and I'll say, I always start yoga recovery with this sentence: our understanding of our suffering defines the nature of our solution. So in yoga of recovery, we have something called healing the habits that bind. It's the 6 tenets of yoga of recovery. Life is longing, life is prana, life is relationship, life is sweet, life is love, and life is progress. And in there, we're pointing out the normal pitfalls. So if you have this longing for an experience beyond the mundane, you might take drugs and it gives you that. But is that a long-term pathway? Unfortunately not. But it will give you a kind of amazing experience. That's coming up for people, like, with trying to treat like deep depression and psychological disorders with some of the psychedelics, do we call them? So, like, for that deep tamas, medicine like that can work, but again, generally not in the long term. So there's different
or not
levels.
supported. Like, it has to go to self-care. Like, it has to be the awakening that then goes into the care model, right? And that's what it can do, is it can shift the consciousness.
And so the biochemical model is doing good work with the short term, the acute care, and it's time to welcome to the table what the people's heart and soul are calling for, which is to recreate the community circle and have that, like, community care. And I don't mean community care when you want fund mental health care and you just kick everybody back onto the streets. That's not community care. That's just, it's barbaric what happens, but that's what can happen. I think at that macro level, we've got people in the recovery, like faces and voices of recovery, you know, advocates at the political level. We've got, I think it's Patrick Kennedy that tells stories about being in the White House with the addiction right there, and people just, you know, turning a blind eye to it, pretending it's not happening. So this runs, it's why it's bio, psycho, social, economic, cultural, political. It's all of that. And the invitation for me is listen to the person's narrative and see where the invitation is to offer a solution. Some people want hatha yoga. Some people want, what do I put on my plate? Some people want Vedanta. You know, they want meditation on self-inquiry and what's the purpose of life. You know, so all those issues bring forth what yoga calls it the afflictions, Kate, you know.
The kleshas,
And then we call it addictions because it's more at this tangible lived experience level. And I think really what it interrupts is our ability to be loving and devoted and caring for each other. Because, you know, there is that kind of feedback, and that's the start of the caretaking and the codependency and the despondency when you're so disappointed in your relationships. You know?
And I just want to emphasize here that the investment therefore has to be out of pocket. The healing recovery, it has to be out of pocket investment, because it's not covered and we're not going to find it. And it has to be in my opinion, it has to be in a dynamic group that understands self-care and the one day at a time, the daily rhythm that awakens the circadian rhythm in our physiology and gets us, you know, able to be stable. Okay, I'm so appreciate your time, Durga. This has been just absolutely lovely to get to know you and your work at Yoga of Recovery. You guys can find Durga on Facebook or on her website, Yoga of Recovery. And I hope to talk again. I'm sorry, I've got a jet. I'm a little late, but such a pleasure to.
I have a request.
Yeah.
Do point me to your urine therapy research, because
Oh,
that's
yeah.
very interesting
Yeah,
to me.
it'll all be in my new book, Uninflamed, but there's also a free guide at yogahealer.com / I think it's called P-Book, PEE-BOOK. Anyone can download that. And I'll send you an advanced copy of Uninflamed. There's 3 chapters in that book of about 100 chapters on urine therapy. Yeah, awesome. Such a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.